So Peter Whitelaw, many of you probably know. Peter's been a consultant for many, many years and wearing various organizational hats in the city of Vancouver, different firms, and he's been working with us at the center on essentially a version of what John has been talking about. Peter and I have been working with a group of graduate students developing a neighborhood level version of this.
I actually cover some of the same material John covered. I'll try to focus primarily on the neighborhood scale, on what we did and how we thought about it, and also try to focus on the concrete results that we expect to be able to show from it. Our aim was really to connect intent with impact. John talked a little bit about policy and how we might use this. From our perspective, if you go back to the video that Mark showed us, there are some 46 different sustainability frameworks out there for cities or neighborhood scale. Most of those frameworks, though, aren't performance frameworks. John's is a standout in that way. They're focused more at the design or development phase or at the policy stage. So the question we asked, and the gap we're trying to fill, is, well, can we measure that actual performance at a neighborhood scale and then connect what we think should have real impacts with the impacts that we're actually seeing on the ground. We chose to do this at the neighborhood scale because it's a nice spot where grassroots action actually connects with government policy. It's a scale at which individuals can get together and do a bit more than just their own small things, and a scale at which you can actually see policy land and create something different on your street, in your neighborhood. That's important because it engenders action, gets people going. They can see things happening, they can see their own impacts. So that's what we're trying to do with our project. We built it around Mark's community capital tool. Partly this is a marriage of convenience because, of course, we're working with Mark and his students, but it's also a really interesting framework because it's an asset-based and community development framework. So as John was saying, this isn't about just monitoring stuff or measuring and comparing. It's about looking at what we can and should do to develop our communities. It's about focusing effort in different areas, using our resources more wisely, and actually developing a shared understanding of where we're at and what's needed. What we're trying to do, in essence, the concept of the community capital tool is simple. We're trying to build capital or build equity. And equity is assets minus liabilities. So whenever we're measuring one of these things, we're looking to measure whether it's an asset or a liability. And one of the interesting things about that is it starts to change how you think about the language and the importance of what we're doing here. So we're used to thinking about a house as an asset, a car as an asset, and a loan as a liability. And we think those are pretty darn important things. We don't necessarily think about good water quality as being an asset and poor water quality as being a liability. Even though it seems obvious when I say it now, it doesn't seem obvious out there in the public consciousness, and it doesn't hit you as hard. For us, this actually it hit us harder when we started using that language of accounting. And so I'll actually use that throughout the rest of my presentation. In speaking about these things, we think it's an interesting thing to think about as to whether we should continue down that path, trying to drive this home. So the second thing is, if this is an accounting lens, the usual thinking, if you're familiar with triple bottom line accounting, is that isn't this 6 forms of capital is more like a 6 bottom lines? And it is somewhat, but we wanted to be really clear about this, that often when people think about or hear about triple bottom line accounting, they interpret it as the idea that it's fine to have a balance, that the final bottom line is the sum of economic, social, and environmental, which means that if your forests are burning and your economy is in the tank, but everybody's happy and safe, that you're still doing okay. From our perspective, you can't balance these different kinds of capitals. You actually need assets in all 6 different areas. So for us, it's very much, curiously, not about balance between the different capitals. It's about developing each of those capital assets and moving them upwards, or in John's triangle, outwards. Kind of hits home in the financial side. We'd like it to hit home in all different aspects. So we spent the spring designing the tool. We dealt with a number of the issues that John addressed. The first one is coming back to John's sets of discussion about scale. And for us, each of these scales, from a person up to a globe, interacts with the scales above and below it, and influence the scales above and below them. So in a neighborhood, the best example that we came across in class is thinking about travel-related impacts. And your neighborhood performance depends very much on the land use patterns in and around your neighborhood and the transportation patterns in and around it. So it makes it very difficult sometimes to compare one neighborhood to another. It makes it very difficult to assign responsibility, if you like, for impacts to the neighborhood, to the residents of the neighborhood. And we were really looking for indicators that assign responsibility appropriately, could be measured at a neighborhood scale. A second issue is a really interesting one. Up here is a picture of Dirk Gently's holistic detectiving. Douglas Adams, in this book, he coined the term fundamental interconnectedness of being, which is hard to say, but great fun. And it summarizes the issue that we all have as human beings when we try to organize the world around us, which is that everything is actually connected. We all think about the organizing pieces in slightly different ways, in slightly different language. So the question for us is, how do we deal with this interconnectivity? If we have, say, water, and we're thinking about water in a neighborhood, there's different components. Do we look for, do we end up with indicators that accidentally duplicate one another? So what we said was, we think with a number of these systems, there are separate indicators that deal with separate components of them. For water, there's a question of water use and conservation in buildings and irrigation, but also many neighborhoods have streams that run through them. And all neighborhoods have water that lands on them and runs through the environment and has an important part to play in the ecosystem. So what we decided to do was to keep indicators of both kinds in a report and to report out on them as John has done with diagrams and so on. We also think it's important to include some integrative discussion about those systemic pieces that run through. Flexibility and comparability. There was a question about weighting earlier, and we thought about weighting. And we thought about customization to different neighborhoods. Soapy Falls Creek and East Clayton are clearly hard to compare, even though they're often compared because they're leading sustainable neighborhoods in the Lower Mainland. So the question for us was, how do we address the desire to always to have some ability to compare, but then the reluctance to do that, and the desire to have a useful comparison. So the approach we've tried to take is to have a core set of indicators that are consistent across all the neighborhoods, but then to allow or even encourage the municipalities or groups that we work with to think about indicators that would customize the assessment and add to the set that we already have. So visual accessible reporting, John's spoken to this already. I don't think I'll say anything more about it except that we like what's been done already, and this is the type of thing we'd imagine doing with our tool. So that means that the report you get is something that you can explain to city council or senior management in an organization very, very quickly, and then you can dive down into areas that require more, that people are more interested in. So it's a very easy thing to do to focus effort and focus conversations through this kind of visual communication. We're quite excited about where we're at. It is very much a work in progress. Based on the work we've done so far, we think the tool can be used in many ways, and I think I've mentioned these. A baseline assessment for neighborhood planning or municipal policy making, a post-occupancy assessment for a green neighborhood. It's helpful to show change over time. Do a baseline, set some policies in place, do another measurement, see if those policies are having an impact, strengthen them, focus elsewhere, etc. And as I said earlier, I think this is a starting point for having the conversations John talked about with stakeholders, with residents and businesses, and saying, guys, we're doing really well with this stuff. Can you help us do better over here? How can we work together to make this a better place? Our next steps, first, University. We're also going to be trying to involve a larger group of people, more advisors, ideally some more pilot communities to work with after we've worked it through the next round with folks at SFU. And our hope really is to make this broader, applicable at a national scale and even out to the world. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you.